Well, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for those of you who are joining from Europe, where it's the afternoon. Good morning to everyone in Washington. We're joining in the US. So thanks for joining this conversation today about a new Senate Foreign Relations Committee majority report entitled The United States and Europe, a Concrete Agenda for Transatlantic Cooperation on China. I'm Jamie Fly. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, currently based in Berlin. And I'm very excited to have with me today Senator Jim Risch, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who was just reelected to a third term as Idaho's 28th senator. Senator Risch has over 4 decades in public service, including serving as the governor of Idaho. Also joining us is David McAllister, who is a member of the European Parliament, chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Good to see you. He's from Germany and is also vice president of the European People's Party. And joining us in a bit will be Tom Tugendhat, who's a member of the British Parliament, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Commons, and has an interesting career, having been a journalist and also serving in the British Armed Forces. So this report that SFRC is releasing today tackles perhaps the #1 priority for transatlantic democracies. It's discussing the challenge posed to the West by the Chinese Communist Party. It's a challenge that I think many of us would agree will test our resolve, our capabilities, and as the report described, is going to confront us in ways which are outside the bounds of our normal national security conversations in the economic, technological, and even the broader realms of our societies. So the U.S. Congress and parliaments across Europe have been central already to this emerging debate about the China challenge. And now this report is being released, and I think it makes an important contribution to that discussion and lays out, as you'll hear, specific recommendations about areas where more transatlantic cooperation might be possible. So we're going to start off with initial remarks from each of our speakers about this topic and about the report, and then I'll moderate a conversation. So Chairman Risch, why don't I turn it over to you to get us started?
Well, Jamie, thank you very much. Thank you for doing this. And to all of you who are joining us today, the number of people participating is in the hundreds, and people from all over the world actually are joining in this conversation today. And I think that, importantly, I think that really reflects the criticality of the issue that we're talking about here today. And it certainly is an issue critical, not only for the United States and Europe, but for the world. And we're honored to have with us today Mr. McAllister and Mr. Tugendhat. Thank you so much for being with us today. And both have long histories of civilian and military service, demonstrating their lifetime commitment to transatlantic security and prosperity. Throughout my years in the Senate, I've advocated for close ties between the United States and Europe, and I'll continue to do so. For decades, the Transatlantic Alliance has worked to address challenges ranging from defense to arms control, trade to human rights. Of course, we have some differences, but those are always greatly exaggerated by those who are motivated to do that. However, mostly unreported is the fact that together, over many years, we have created and advanced the modern institutions that provide a quality of governance and life the world has never seen, including, of course, Nato, the most successful cultural and military alliance in the history of the world. These efforts have been crucial to helping ensure a free and open international system that is defined by free market, economic growth, individual freedom, rule of law, and collective security. Today, the most consequential challenge to these shared interests and values is the People's Republic of China, led by the Chinese Communist Party. China aims to undermine the fundamental security and integrity of our democratic societies through malign influence in our media, education systems, international organizations, and even local governments. Its ecosystem of anti-competitive economic policies hurts U.S. and European businesses and risks the prosperity created by the market-driven growth that we have established. At the same time, the People's Liberation Army is aggressively expanding its power to become a global force, as we all know. Co-opting China's overseas commercial activity, military purposes and coercing its neighbors into doing its bidding. China has become a true systemic rival to shared American and European interests. Both sides of the Atlantic increasingly recognize this reality. Now, we have to turn this agreement into action. Neither the United States nor Europe will be able to combat these threats alone. Those who suggest that possibility are simply wrong. China is simply too large and too well equipped. This important work has already begun. We're better prepared to safeguard critical assets and technologies from state-directed investment. We have come together at the UN to stand up for the rights of the Chinese people. And we have advanced shared principles on secure future telecommunications networks. The United States and the European Union have established a formal dialogue on China, and NATO is increasing its focus on the threat as well. But this is just the beginning. This challenge requires a shared and sustained commitment over the long term. Countries on both sides of the Atlantic must commit to prioritizing China as a major issue in our respective foreign and economic policies, since our objectives are so different compared to China. Perhaps more importantly, we have to commit to partnering with each other, even when we disagree. To help us strengthen those commitments, I'm proud today to announce the publication of a new Senate Foreign Relations Committee report entitled The United States and Europe, a Concrete Agenda for Transatlantic Cooperation on China. It is lengthy, but it is detailed, and those details are important. The report recommends safeguarding our free and open societies from a new authoritarian advance, upholding the integrity of international organizations, combat unfair trade practices and anti-competitive economic statecraft, developing new technologies and shape how they are used, addressing the economic and security implications of PRC's investment through the One Belt, One Road initiative, and deepening transatlantic partnership in Africa and the Indo-Pacific. It is clear the PRC is making inroads in all of these areas, and that the United States and Europe will be worse off if we take on these challenges individually. Cooperation is therefore a key to protecting our shared values and interests. Legislators like ourselves must play a role in both bringing these issues to the forefront of transatlantic discussions and tackling them together. Like the strategic competition and systemic rivalry with China itself, this agenda will evolve as time goes on. This is the beginning of what should be many fruitful discussions as we chart a cooperative path forward. My colleagues across the Atlantic, again, thank you for joining today. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your remarks and our discussion. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Chairman Risch. So, Mr. McAllister, Chairman Risch talked about how we cannot combat this challenge alone, and obviously called for more transatlantic coordination. Interested to hear your initial comments on the report and on this topic.
Yes, thank you. First of all, Chairman Risch, congratulations on your re-election as Senator for Idaho, and all the best for the new term, and of course kind regards to my friend Tom Tugendhat in London. It's a pleasure for me to briefly share my views on this relevant topic. I would like to first of all congratulate the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee on this report and the key recommendations that have been outlined for a stronger Atlantic cooperation on China. This report is definitely published at a very critical moment in transatlantic relations and in our dealings with China. The COVID-19 pandemic has further accentuated China's assertiveness and foreign policy ambitions. It has also exposed once again the necessity for us as Western democracies to pool our resources in the fight against the pandemic, but also in the fight against disinformation and the protection of democratic values. Even before this pandemic, we were concerned about unfair Chinese trade practices and the disrespect for human rights on both sides of the Atlantic. We all deeply condemn the imposition of the Hong Kong national security law and its detrimental impact on the autonomy under the rule of law. We're all deeply concerned by Chinese expansionism and assertiveness on a range of foreign policy and economic issues. Now, we all witnessed that United States-China relations were strained in recent years. Chairman Risch was referring to this. And there was perhaps not enough room for cooperation between the European Union and its 27 member states and the United States on this. That's why I think it's important that we keep all channels of communication open, that we listen to each other, that we work with each other responsibly, and hopefully we can do this more in the future. I see new opportunities for transatlantic cooperation, and I certainly believe a coordinated approach to some of the challenges posed by the communist leadership in China is one of the areas where new opportunities would become available. China has recently signed the world's largest free trade agreement, RCEP. We all followed the news at the weekend. And this agreement, to a certain degree, will redraw the economic and strategic map of the Indo-Pacific. So I believe this new trade agreement and the Chinese influence should be a wake-up call for us. If we want to prevent China from setting global standards in trade in the future, we must strengthen the transatlantic relationship and act together on the world stage. I very much regretted, and I still regret, the failure of transatlantic cooperation on trade, namely TTIP. But now it is time to restart our partnership and strengthen our ties, also when it comes on dealing with China. We had a debate in the European Parliament just a few weeks ago how to deal with China, and my esteemed colleague Radek Sikorski put it into three very interesting and easy points. We need to cooperate where possible, we need to compete where needed, and we need to confront where necessary. Of course, cooperation with China on global issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic or mitigating climate change is decisive. Regarding China, we should adapt the three mentioned principles. The concerns we are sharing as regards Chinese behavior must also be addressed. These include unfair trade practice, cybersecurity, disinformation, and the quest for technological dominance. The European Union is more and more united in its stance towards China, as well as more critical. If China wants to cooperate with us, fine, but then they have to walk the talk and deliver on their promises on trade practices, human rights, and climate change. Finally, China is quite clear in its ambition. It wants a technology sector that is free from geopolitically sensitive dependencies, and indeed wants a dominant position in all technologies that are likely to play a central role in the future of warfare. This has potentially far-reaching strategic consequences, not only for the European Union and the United Kingdom, but also for the United States, not just on trade, but on security as well. So I see, to conclude, future EU-US cooperation as regards China effective on three issues: trade, technology, and multilateralism. On trade, we should regain its importance for the transatlantic relationship in order to regain our historical role as rule makers and not rule takers. Third countries, including China, have been using the opportunity created by the void in transatlantic trade to their advantage and to create rules to which we certainly do not want to subscribe. Second, on technology, we should pool joint funding and cooperation efforts on emerging technologies to compete with Beijing. And thirdly, concerning multilateralism, the European Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and other partners should work stronger together on reforming international organizations to be better fit for the service and protection of a global rules-based order. A final remark on foreign affairs. In his report, or in your report, you mention stronger transatlantic cooperation to curb Chinese influence in Africa and in the Indo-Pacific. That's absolutely okay with me. I fully agree. I would like to add further regions, especially the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe. We can build on the already close transatlantic cooperation to limit Chinese and Russian propaganda and further support the pursuit of these countries for democratic values. So thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And now I'm looking forward to listening to my friend Tom Tugendhat.
Great. Thanks, Mr. McAllister. And a lot of overlap with, I think, themes identified in the report and some new suggestions as well of other areas for cooperation. Tom, are you with us?
Jamie, it's been good to see you, but the connection wasn't great. I hope you can see and hear me now.
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear. Over to you for your initial comments.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Well, look, first of all, it's such a pleasure to see David again. We're only a few miles apart, but these latest COVID months have felt like years, and we've been rather more separate than we should be. And it's great to be here with Senator Risch as well, whom I'm yet to meet, but congratulations on his re-election. And Jamie, it's great to see you. Look, this is a really interesting report, and I think it's incredibly timely, because not only are we looking all at the same direction, and indeed some of you will have seen much of the work that the committee I'm privileged enough to chair has done on a similar question, but we're actually all three parliaments in our own ways leading change. And this is something that I think is fundamental to the question we're asking ourselves today, and which is why this report is so important. Because the change we're looking to lead is not just a minor technical variation on an existing policy, which is so often the case in foreign affairs. It is actually a revolution in the way that we approach ourselves and others. Because what we're seeing before us is a revolution, and I think we should be clear about what the challenge is. What China is offering today is not merely a growing element of power, as various elements are changing. It is actually a direct change to the operating system of the world. It's a much more centralized, much less distributed network that is trying to shape and influence people by state power. Now, this is clearly against the interests of the British people. I think it's against the interests of most European people, and certainly from when I hear people like Senator Risch speaking, and indeed many of my other friends in the Senate and Congress, it's quite clear to me that most Americans feel that it is against their interests too. And that's not surprising, because actually the fundamental challenge that the American people and all the rest of us are faced with is who is going to decide our future. And the way we've traditionally done it is we've done it ourselves. We've done it through democratic change, through academic enterprise, and through imagination. That is not the way the government in Beijing wishes to make the change. And so I'm very interested to see the areas that Senator Risch and his committee have set out. I'm going to build on one of the areas, though, and that's the area of international organizations. Because although I agree with all of it, I think the international organizations is an element where we could go further. Because actually, one of the things that we've all noticed in various different ways around the world over the last few years is that established structures are increasingly challenged. They're increasingly finding it harder and harder to maintain the level of legitimacy that they did when they were initially established. Even the UN, the most international organization of them all, is struggling to maintain the legitimacy that it had, for example, when President Kennedy used it so effectively to defend global freedom. And so the challenge is, what do we do? What do we do as international operators, as nations and organizations that have global interests and global reach? Well, I think this is where we partner, but in different ways. And looking at softer alliances, more flexible, more variable, we can, I think, find ways in which partnerships can be built up to defend the rules, to defend the systems, to defend the practices that we have made, and to put ourselves in a position where what we're doing is, in a softer, more gentle way, reinforcing the international order, so that effectively what we're doing is we're acting as the buttress to it and helping to challenge growth from major powers into a rules-based system. Now, this, I think, is a series of, if you like, Venn diagrams of overlapping circles, where some countries will be in many of them and others will only be in a few. So maybe you'll have a trade 50 or 60 of countries that actually do respect intellectual property rights and the rule of law. Maybe you'll have a democratic 60 or 70, in which countries that practice free and fair elections support each other in UN bodies. Maybe you'll have a vaccine 80 or 90, in which those countries that are willing to share not just the science, but also the distribution burden around the world are able to participate and see their economies grow as quickly as possible, resistant to the pressures that would otherwise be wielded by countries that seek to use vaccine as a means of control. And you can see that through these areas, and indeed in others, from AI or the environment or many other areas that are yet to be thought of, we could look at a new way of working with countries around the world, and not leading in the traditional sense, but enabling others to participate fully in a global system that actually does defend their interests and not merely find themselves subservient to a national one that seeks to undermine them. I shall leave it there and hand over to you, Jamie, I think, is it?
Yes, thanks, Tom. So Chairman Risch is voting currently, so I'm going to start the conversation with Mr. McAllister. And he's back. Great. So actually, I'll start with you, Chairman Risch.
Before you start, Jamie, let me thank my colleagues from across the pond for their remarks. I think, importantly, for the hundreds of people that are on this call, we have underscored, the three of us, the importance of what we're dealing with here and the pivot that we're attempting to make here that Mr. Tugendhat referred to as revolutionary. I think the word revolutionary isn't too strong a word because the challenge that we're facing is revolutionary, and the response to that has got to be a revolutionary response, a different way of not only thinking about it, but also dealing with it. So thank you to both of you for that, and I hope we've communicated that to the rest of the world. Jamie, to you.
So Chairman Risch, I actually wanted to pick up on Tom's last point about international organizations, because I thought the report did a good job of describing the challenges in China's attempt to dominate international organizations. And I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about what the Western democracies are facing in the multilateral system when it comes to Chinese influence. And just to get your response to Tom's idea that we maybe need more flexible, adaptable institutions to deal with this China challenge.
Well, really a good point. You know, these institutions were essentially developed without China. They were developed by democracies, democratic people, free people who were used to dealing in these kinds of things. The Chinese have no experience in this because they don't have those kind of freedoms, and they certainly don't have that kind of democracy. And so as they come in to use the word take over or hijack these agencies, or just as importantly, subdivisions of those agencies like committees or the subdivisions of them, they do it in a different way than we do. We do it, democratic agencies do this by debating, by discussing, by attempting to persuade. The Chinese have a very, very different way of doing this. And they obviously, we all know with their financial enterprises around the world, have the ability to make agreements, whether it be the trading of debt forgiveness or what have you for votes. That's not the way we do this in the Western world. It's not the way we do this in democracy. And that greatly endangers this. And I think virtually everyone that works in the space that we work in has seen the Chinese aggressively attempt to put in heads of these subdivisions that are Chinese and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and then hire people below them. Right now, the Universal Postal Union election is coming up. China has a candidate. We've seen this in others like aviation, where this has been very aggressive by the Chinese. This is something we got to be careful of. We've got to combat.
Mr. McAllister, I wanted to pick up on your comments about trade, which I was struck by the ambition of your proposal, and Others, the German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer recently also made a similar proposal in a widely discussed speech. How realistic do you think it is right now to aim big when it comes to transatlantic trade, given a lot of the political blowback to free trade on both sides of the Atlantic? How realistic is that proposal?
Thank you for the question. One point on what Senator Risch just said. I think we all agree that multilateralism needs a boost and that it's important to reform international organizations to make them stronger in the end and not to weaken international organizations or even to destroy them. And that's why, may I say that as a German who's serving in the European Parliament, we would welcome the US return to international organizations. We need more American engagement in the United Nations. We need American engagement in the reform of the World Trade Organization. And also we would welcome the American return to the World Health Organization, because whenever the United States pull out, whenever you withdraw, China's there to fill the spaces. And that's why we need the United States as the leader of an alliance of Western democracies, including the EU27, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and others. And that's why I do hope that there will be quite some room for improvement when it comes to this. Now, on trade, there's a lot of enthusiasm in Europe about a restart of transatlantic relations. And I think that in style and tone, many things will improve. But there are two challenges we will continue to face. The one is security and defense. I think the new administration in Washington will be calling, just as the current administration and the previous one of President Obama, but we in Europe have to do more for our own security and defense and also spend more. And the other thing is trade. Trade is the bread and butter of transatlantic relations. And there have always been challenges in trade relations. But what we saw in the last few years just simply wasn't helpful for both sides. And that's why I mentioned this new trade agreement between China and other countries in the Indo-Pacific. This should be a wake-up call. We need closer cooperation on trade between the United States and Europe. I don't know if it will be possible to get something done similar to TTIP. It might be TTIP minus X, it might be a TTIP light. But what we need to do is get more reliability and more predictability in our trade relations. And we should stop talking about each other, but sitting down and talking more with each other, how we can improve trade relations to the benefit of the people and the countries on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thanks for that. Tom, turning to you, I want to pick up on another area that the report covers, which is technology cooperation across the Atlantic. And the report actually proposes a technology coalition of advanced democracies, which I think is similar to the sort of flexible coalitions that you were describing. But given the British experience, which you were a key player in the debate about Huawei in the UK, what are the lessons learned as we've been grappling across the Atlantic with some of these initial fights over technology? You can talk a little bit more about what do we need in the future to make these less difficult conversations within our societies?
Sure. Look, I think that's an important question, because the reality is that we've got to start off by being honest with ourselves. What we're seeing emerging is not simple business competition that we might see if we were a US company competing against a UK company, for example, where you're just simply seeing who's making the better kit and who's pricing it better for the market. Pretty much that's it. What we're seeing with China is something quite different. We're seeing effectively tech dumping under cost sales, and we're seeing it because of state assets being used to subsidize international sales. And we're seeing it because this is an attempt at control, not direct control as in simply trying to switch the lights on or off, but control of an area of industry that will give advantage into the future, and with any luck to the organization or nation that is developing it, will effectively close out competition. And so what we need to do, and I think this is one of the areas where I very much welcome Senator Risch's work, is we need to look at how do we make sure that those nations whose companies do obey the rules, don't steal technology, and do operate open and transparent competition policy, are able to compete with each other, and those that don't are not allowed to seek to achieve monopolistic positions against our interests. Now, this is where I think Senator Risch and David McAllister have an awful lot to do together, along with us, and by the way, along with Japan, South Korea, and indeed India and Australia as well. Because what we need to do is we need to build up partners around the world so that we actually have large enough markets for each of these, for our companies, so that when they innovate, when they develop, they actually have places to go. But that also means, I'm afraid, to a certain extent, being much harder on closing out those who do not play by the rules. Now, we had a hell of a fight here over Huawei, and I'm very glad to say that the government has agreed that the incentives are now clear and the decision is now made. And that's great news. But there are countries, even in the free world, where those decisions have not yet been made. And what they are doing effectively is undermining the rest of us by those decisions. And I find that very unfortunate.
Thanks. Chairman Risch, feel free to respond to any of those points, but I also just wanted to ask you to maybe comment about where you see NATO fitting into this response to the China challenge, because the report identifies a number of security areas, including things like undersea cables, that are going to be significant issues for democracies on both sides of the Atlantic. And so if you could maybe say something about how we need to adapt NATO as part of our response to China.
Thanks, Jimmy. First of all, in response to David's remarks about the gentle nudge towards U.S. participation in international organizations, I accept that certainly in the spirit in which it was offered, number one. And number two, I can tell you that that will not be a suggestion that is widely rejected as we go forward. It's kind of a backwards way of saying we will move forward, and your suggestions are not isolated. We have discussions of all those things that right here in the United States. And Tom, your suggestion about the importance of partnerships is really incredible. And as you mentioned, and I would fully agree that we need to cooperate. We need to have partnerships. And the converse of that is true. And that is people who reject the rule of law, people who reject international norms, really need to be receive the treatment they deserve in the international marketplace, because we cannot survive without the rule of law that we developed nations have developed in recent decades and even over centuries as we've traded between nations. These are so important. And there's nothing to underscore the fact there's no one here trying to keep China down. China is going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to mature. Its quality of life for its people is going to increase. But they have got to develop a rule of law, and just as importantly, enforce that rule of law and embrace the international norms if they're going to trade on the international stage. So thank you for those remarks. Look, NATO, let me turn to NATO for a minute. NATO, there's been, over the last some years, there's been this constant tug of war regarding NATO that, in my judgment, is needless. We in the United States have, over decades, have urged our friends and fellow members of NATO to meet the commitments and pay the amounts. And we've got a president over the last 4 years who's been very vocal in that regard. But it is a minor part of what NATO does, what they've been able to accomplish, the importance of their very existence. I've had friends of mine from Europe suggest that somehow the United States was considering pulling out of NATO. That is not the case. It has never been the case. It is not going to happen. NATO, as I said, is the most successful cultural and political alliance the world has ever seen. Anyone who would give even a thought to withdrawing or undermining that is headed in the wrong direction. So let's now turn to NATO's part in this. NATO, as we know, is a large blanket that covers a large part of the world when it comes to security. And that security is so important, not just to the part of the world that it covers, but to the rest of the world. And it needs to exercise the obligations it's been given by all of the member countries, and it needs to do so robustly, and it needs to claim to the world that we want to defend ourselves, and we're going to defend ourselves, and we're going to hold hands while we do it. So I think that as we go forward, NATO is going to play a very important role in this. They obviously have a lot of threads out when it comes to intelligence matters and when it comes to development of defensive ways of doing things. That's going to continue and should continue.
Mr. McAllister, just to pick up a bit on the international organization question and actually tie it to something which I think you referred to, the challenge I think from a US perspective is China is very effective at bogging its partners down in either process, whether it's in an international organization or on issues like climate, using these issues to distract from the broader agenda that some of us in the US or Europe may want to focus on, especially now that there's more talk about re-engaging China on climate. How do we manage this challenge? How do we bring China to the table on issues we want to engage them on without allowing them to gloss over the broader problematic agenda that they do not want to discuss on the world stage?
First of all, I couldn't agree more with Senator Risch's analysis of NATO. I believe that deepening NATO engagement with our Indo-Pacific partners would definitely be beneficial. And Tom and James, you might have followed that after France, Germany is now the second country which has presented an own Indo-Pacific strategy. And this shows that Germany, unlike France or the UK, which doesn't have any kind of overseas territories in this part of the world, still recognizes how important it is. So I believe that under the auspices of NATO, we could develop a transatlantic security strategy vis-a-vis China. Now, when it comes to concrete policy issues, you named climate change. China has made significant commitments to combat climate change over the last years. But now China needs to transform its commitments into actions. And we in Europe are increasingly, how can I put it, suffering from a promise fatigue, which resulted in a shift in our attitude towards China. In the end, a partnership can only be based on reciprocity. But I also believe that to some degree, China wasn't only using climate change commitments to distract from its agenda in other areas, and we've been talking about the critical points, but was also, and sorry, I don't want Senator Risch to blame me of nudging again, but perhaps China was also using this opportunity to fill in a gap left open by the US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. So what I believe is that we also, on the crucially important issue of climate, we need more and better transatlantic cooperation. And in general, what you see is, as soon as we make space in international organizations, as soon as we start weakening multilateralism, China is there to take over. And this is something we have to bear in mind in future. And just let me make a final point. also the way China bullies other countries. Just one example, Taiwan's application for the World Health Organization should be supported jointly by the European Union, the United Kingdom, and also our transatlantic friends in Canada, and of course in the United States.
Thank you. And Tom, I'll turn to you, and we're running out of time, and I'm going to give the final word to Chairman Risch in a minute, but why don't you maybe pick up on that last point from Mr. McAllister about Taiwan. You've also been central to the debate in the UK about what's been happening in Hong Kong. Feel free to respond to anything you've heard, but also maybe a few comments about what more the transatlantic democracies can do together on fundamental issues of freedom as they relate to China.
Sure. Look, I think there's a few issues here. The first on Taiwan, I completely agree with my friend David. He's absolutely right. And it's pretty extraordinary that China, a country that contributes so little to the World Health Organization in financial terms, compare to the US, UK, and indeed the Gates Foundation, all of which contribute vastly more than the People's Republic of China, is being bullied by such a nation. It's outrageous, and what it does actually demonstrate is it demonstrates that when we're not willing to fight, others are. And it reminds me of that Belloc poem, Pale Ebenezer thought it wrong to fight, but Roaring Bill, who killed him, thought it right. And we find ourselves so often in the UN and in international bodies not willing to make the fight, and finding that instead what happens is that others step in. Now, look, there are really good examples of US leadership in the international space, and I'm going to pick out a friend of mine, David Beasley, the former governor of South Carolina, who leads the World Food Programme, the organization that's got the Nobel Prize this year. This is a US demonstration of leadership, the like of which we have missed in many places for too long. But it's also a demonstration of where, when we work together, when somebody like Governor Beasley is able to not just secure US support, but because of his rare political talents, is able to secure support from other democracies around the world, which he's done extremely effectively. He's able to make very, very important changes to our world. And so I think there's a real lesson in here for all of us, which is that cooperation can be built up and can be deepened. And so I look at organizations like the CPTPP, as it now is, with a few extra words at the beginning. And I hope very much that the UK will be joining that, and that perhaps even the United States will, because finding ways in which we structure our cooperation will be about how we defend freedom. It is only by standing together that we defend freedom. And for those of us who have served alongside each other in battle, as I've had the privilege to serve alongside Germans of from David's country, and alongside the 82nd and the US Marine Corps from Senator Risch's country in Iraq and Afghanistan, I can tell you we work well together. We really do. And we have invested a huge amount over the last 70, 80 years into creating this international system that has allowed people to prosper in peace, mostly, for many decades. And it really it's now our watch, and it's up to us to defend it.
Well, thanks for that, Tom, and thanks to all of you for very practical proposals and a constructive conversation. Hopefully the report will just be the beginning of a lot of transatlantic cooperation. I'll turn it back to Chairman Risch to make some closing comments.
Just briefly, because we are out of time, I want to say that, first of all, thank you for what I think is an important dialogue here today. But importantly, this report that was put out is not narrow, it's broad. It was shopped broadly with both political parties, with all viewpoints, conservative, liberal, etc. And it attempted to bring together all the many disjointed proposals that are kicking around regarding China. I know in your countries as here, everyone gets an idea, but that idea usually is pretty narrow. This is designed to be a pamphlet as we go forward to address the broader issues that have got to be resolved before we can even get to those narrow issues. And as I want to underscore again, this cannot be done by any one of us alone. It really needs to be done in a joint effort by the U.S., by the UK, by the EU, and for that matter by Australia and Canada and all other countries that want to do business the way we have done business on this planet for many decades now. And although we wind up with disputes from time to time, it's important that we have institutions that can resolve those in a way that people have confidence in them. So again, thank you for joining here. I hope this is the beginning of a long dialogue on how we address these challenges. The challenges are different. I think it's become obvious to the world that the challenges that we face here are not the de minimis things that we talked about a decade ago or so, that this has grown to a point where it really needs to be addressed. And our efforts here today hopefully take a significant step forward in addressing those. So again, thank you very much. And Jamie, thank you for monitoring this for us.
Great, thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Have a good day.